Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting another mini cottage. This is based off an image that I found of a sculpture by Cinderella Moments, and it's such a cute European style cottage. I love the woodwork and the combination of textures on the roof as well as the viney flowers, so I decided to make my own version. I also like how simple and small the cottage is, and it's just perfect in terms of the size and shape for my sketchbook size. I'll just put a small thumbnail on the left here as I'm sketching, but for the colors I'll just come up with my own combination. Of course, I'll leave the link to the website of the reference image in my description box so you can see other cute dollhouse creations as well, because there are just so many beautiful types. For the sketch, I always start with the main shape, which is the building itself, and after that, I like to divide up the spacing of the first and second floor before adding on the features like the windows and the door. At this point, I always sketch so quickly and loosely without putting too much pressure on my pencil. As you can see, I'm also holding the pencil quite far back. This way, I won't be wasting too much time if I need to erase huge areas in case I don't like how I place something out, or if the spacing didn't turn out well for the size of the paper that I have. Luckily for this sketch, there were no major changes, so I kept adding on the features around the house to decorate and frame the composition with things like potted plants and flower bushes. I think this is enough for the sketch. It's light enough for me to paint over even if it's a bit messy, but you can also clean out the outlines if you feel that it'll be easier to follow when you're painting. And for those of you who want to jump straight to painting, I'll have the outline available for you guys to download in my coffee shop. Next, I'm going to go over the colors that I'll be using. On the left here, I have Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins, or you can also use white gouache. And for the colors, this is Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Cerulean Blue by Holbein, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Chinese White by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, and Aquarius Green by Szmal. Now let's begin to paint. I always like to start out with whatever's in front. This way it's much easier to paint around it without leaving or guessing the negative space that I need to leave. I'm going to start with a potted flower, and for this I used a mix of cerulean blue with a bit of crimson lake and also Chinese white to create this periwinkle blue. I'm painting very small individual flowers that I bunch up together, but I like to also play around with how many is within a bunch. Sometimes I like to also add some individual ones as well. This is just so the composition looks a bit more natural. But notice how even if I'm painting loosely, I'm still painting the flowers with purpose instead of just dotting in random areas. For the green area of this plant, I use a mix of Aquarius green with Hansa yellow. And for this, then I dot the areas around the flowers, and I also want to make the outer portion or the silhouette of the overall plant nice and uneven, so again it looks more natural. Then while the surface is still wet, I added a little bit of burnt umber, indigo, and more Aquarius green for the darker value, placing them under the flowers while the surface is still damp, and this will make the brighter colors of the flowers pop out more. The flowers should be dry, so for the detail on top, I just added more Crimson Lake as well as Cerulean Blue into the previous mix, then I just dot in a bit more texture on top. Moving on to the next flower, I used a mix of Crimson Lake and Chinese White, and this time I'm going to twirl my brush and create dots with slightly different shapes because of the twirling motion, and I also like to play with the size of the flowers. Then just like the previous flower pot, I use a mix of Aquarius green and Hansa yellow for the greeneries. Since I'm painting fairly small areas here, I'm using mostly a light load when applying the paint, especially for the flowers, so they're much easier to dry. When you are adding on the greens, it's preferable to wait for the color of the flowers to completely dry. This way, when you're adding on the green won't mingle too much with the color of the flowers, creating a muddy mess. Moving on to the flower bush in front. For this I used a mix of Crimson Lake and Hansa yellow to create this orange, and I also made the flowers much larger, so there's a variety of different sizes. I also think about how they wrap around the bush, so for the flowers along the edges of the top and the sides, I made the silhouette a little bit more flat compared to the flowers which are facing us. Then with the same light green, I added the stems for the individual flowers. This time for the leaves, I want them to be long and pointy for a different texture. But just like the first flower pot, after adding on the first layer, I use the same dark mix to add more leaf textures, so there's more depth and form in this flower bush. Moving on to the one behind, I want to add some tall flowers. I'm sort of just zigzagging my brush and creating some dots following the length of these flowers. And in terms of the color, I used the same pink mixture as before, which is from Crimson Lake and Chinese White. And sometimes I like to add a little bit of indigo to create more of a purple as well as burgundy tones. Again, I'm going to treat the greeneries the same way as before, using a mix of Aquarius green and Hansa yellow, but this time I'm going to make a more bushy texture instead of those individual long leaves. I'm also just going to go over the whole area instead of painting on the single stems. Once I've covered the area of the bush that I want, I'm going to use the dark green mixture and apply it to the bottom of the bush. This way it'll separate this one with the bush in front. Since there's a large area of a light green at the back, I also decided to break it up with a dark green, and I also want to add this darker value at the bottom of the bush in front as well. Now let's move on to the viney flowers. I'm going to twirl my brush around to create circles in different sizes, and this is to create rose-like petals. For this, I chose this orange color or deep yellow color by mixing Crimson Lake and Hansa Yellow Medium, but after applying the green next to these flowers, I find that pink or red might be a better color to contrast the green, but I just went along with it since I've already used this color for the base. When I was painting on the base color of the green as well, I think my brush was still dirty with a bit of the Crimson Lake, which is why the green is also very warm and earthy, but I just tried to separate the green and the yellow by applying the darker value around the flowers while the surface of the green is still damp. Now I'm just going to move along and paint the rest of the viney areas. For this small area at the corner, I felt like my brush load was a little bit too wet for this tiny section. This is why I didn't add on the darker value, if not it's just going to spread everywhere. So meanwhile, I just wait for it to dry and move on to paint this pot. For the base color of the pot, I used a mix of burnt umber, Crimson Lake, and Hansa yellow. It was a little bit too wet to add on the darker value, so I decided to take off some paint before adding on a thicker consistency with more burnt umber. Then I applied a little bit more of the base color. Now moving on to the thatched textured roof. For this I used a light consistency mix of the orange as well as yellow ochre. I applied the base with a dry load so it's quick to dry, and here I'm applying the second layer using a slightly thicker consistency. And for the darkest value here, I switched to my small brush so it's much easier to apply the small areas. Since the edges are a little bit too harsh for my liking, I ended up going over the whole area using clean water so the colors blend into each other a bit more, and I also applied the darker value while the surface is still damp around the greeneries to separate them from the roof. In terms of the dark brown color, I used a mix of burnt umber and indigo. I'm going to apply the same color and technique for the roof as well. After this, I'm going to paint the bottom of the thatched roof, and I want the color to be fairly light and neutral. So I used a mix of the really dark brown with the green that I had on my palette. I just switched them together by adding a bit of water, and I'm using a thin consistency to just give a flat wash to the frames of the roof. I want to make sure that these areas are dry so I can apply a second layer. I'm just adding on thin lines across those areas using my small brush. I'm also going to use the same color for the timber frames as well as the window frames. Just like before, I'm using a light consistency. I also switched to my larger brush so it's easier to cover a larger area. Notice how I'm painting the wooden support underneath the roof separately. This is so I can keep those shapes separated if I paint one after the other once the previous area is completely dry. If not, the paint will just run into each other, creating a flat wash. For the pot underneath the window, I want to keep the color nice and light, and I'm not going to create any new colors, so I just added more burnt umber into the previous mixture to change up the tone slightly. And while the surface is still wet, I used a darker version of the color to paint underneath the plant. I want to introduce a different hue to the window covers, but I still want it to be consistent with the rest of the muted tones. So for this, I used a mix of cerulean blue with Hansa yellow, but the Hansa yellow in my palette had a little bit of the crimson lake from the orange mixture, which made this tone a bit more muted. Moving on to the chimney, I used a mix of yellow ochre, Hansa yellow, and a bit of crimson lake to paint the base color. As I was painting this though, I found that the color is a bit too vibrant compared to the other features of the house. So while the surface is still damp, I decided to add that gray mixture from earlier, especially around the edges, and I tried to soften part of the blend between those colors to tone down the vibrancy. Now that the frames of the windows are completely dry, I used the same gray mixture in a thicker consistency to add details using my size 0 brush. I just added lines around the frames as an outline, as well as the center outline of the window frames as well. As for the window covers, I used the same green as before, and I'm going to add lines following the direction and the perspective of these window covers. So the lines follow the angle, slowly getting a bit more horizontal as it reaches the center, and then slanting in a different direction as it gets towards the bottom. I also added frames to the covers using the same color. Here I'm adding a bit of detail to the door, and after this I'm going to paint the base color of the wall. For this I use the same color as the chimney, but then I added some Chinese white as well as yellow ochre to create more of a neutral creamy color, and I applied this using a really thin consistency. While the surface is still damp, I use a slightly thicker consistency, especially in between the frames for a darker value. For the stairs underneath the door, I used a mix of the gray from the frames with the base color of the wall to create a slightly different tone from each other, and this way I don't have to create a completely different color. But I just paint them flatly before adding on the darker shadows to separate those steps. Here I'm creating a different tone of gray, which is slightly cooler. This is from a mix of burnt umber, indigo, and a little bit of the orange mixture. I'm using a thin consistency here to paint the rock pavement in front of the house. Then I follow this up by using a slightly thicker consistency to paint the bottom part of each of those rocks to give it a slight lift. You can wait for the paved rocks to be completely dry, but I'm just going to try my best to paint around it using this green mixture. I personally don't mind it so much if the colors mingle with each other slightly because I don't want this to be the focal point anyway, so I find it okay if it looks slightly messy. The stairs should be completely dry, so I use the gray mixture to add on lines to separate those steps. I've also forgotten to paint the outline to the door as well as the window in the door, so I'm just doing this now using the same gray. After this, I'm going to paint the glass window, in which case I'm just going to use a really thin consistency of indigo first, just to sort of create a tint as well as a wet or damp surface. Then while the surface is still damp, I use a slightly thicker consistency of indigo, and here I'm just creating some abstract texture so it looks like something is reflected off the glass. For the larger window, I tried to avoid painting on the curtain area. In fact, I tried to separate those two areas by outlining the curtain itself. Then I use a really thin consistency of indigo to add curved lines for the texture of the curtains. Once the windows are dry, I felt like some of the colors faded too much, so I ended up going over certain areas to increase the value. Then I'm going to add an outline around the windows using a thick consistency of indigo. Now let's move on to the background. I used a mix of Aquarius green with Hansa yellow, and I'm using a really light consistency to paint some leaf textures behind. Then while the surface is still damp, I use a thin consistency of a green with more Aquarius green in the mix for some slight variation in color. I also painted in between the fence as well as added a bush on the left side as well. For the brick textures, I just used burnt umber with indigo and a bit of Aquarius green to paint the outline of the bricks. Then, since I accidentally went over the horizontal fence, I just used the thick consistency of bleed-proof white to correct that area. While I still have bleed-proof white on my brush, I'm going to dot in some white for the flowers, and this is just some random areas if I feel it looks a bit dense to lighten up the composition slightly. After that, I'm going to draw the rest of the frames using a dry brush load, so it's much easier to paint those thin lines for the rest of the frames. I also applied bleed-proof white on the bush here. This is to create a white base so I can paint a blue butterfly on top. For the fine details of the butterflies, like the antennas and the body, I just used a mix of burnt umber and indigo. Then for the fence here, after the white is dry, I used the same color as the wall. I felt like the separation looks too harsh here, so I ended up adding a really light consistency of green to soften the blend. I feel like I'm done with the painting, but I want to redefine certain areas. You can do this using paint and a size 0 brush, but I just find outlining using colored pencils is much easier. You can use any colored pencils you have, even hobby grade ones. I like using my Faber-Castell hobby grade colored pencils to do this too, as you guys know if you've been here for a while. And for those lines, I just used a dark brown or something similar to a sepia. If it's easier for you and more easily available, you can also use ink pen to outline. You can use browns or black as well. I personally prefer brown because it has a softer look and a warmer look. And I also prefer using colored pencils because I'm looking for a whimsical style, and the texture of the colored pencils I find brings more character and a rustic feel. So from here, I'm just going to continue to add the outlines for areas where I feel needs a bit more detail, texture, or definition. Finally, I decided to add more timber frames as extra decoration to the house. I'm also going to add trails to the butterfly, which I kind of found to be a mistake because for some reason my head thinks it's a fly now, but it's too late, so I just left it. And that's basically it for this painting. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing so you can get notified of more content like this. I post new tutorials every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!